Good day, everybody, and welcome to the National Council of Resistance of Iran, U.S. Representative Office. My name is Alireza Jafarzadeh, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Washington office of the NCRI. Today, we have another virtual panel discussion on the issue of the imperative to reimpose all UN Security Council resolutions back on the Iranian regime. We'll discuss the implications of any lifting of the arms embargo, which is coming October 18th. And the most urgent one, as I said, this one, but also other sanctions that will be lifted down the road. And what's the need to really prevent that. But before I briefly introduce my fellow panelists, I would like to mention that this event is broadcast live on our website, www.ncri-US.org, as well as on our social media tools at NCRI-US. That's our Twitter account. We'll have our panel members to make their opening remarks, followed by a question and answer session. The audience who have joined us on Zoom, they can write their questions on the Q&A tool. Those who are watching us on other means, they can email the questions to media@ncri-us.org. But let me briefly introduce the panel members. First, we have Honorable Joseph DiTrani. Mr. DiTrani is the former director of the National Counterproliferation Center and special advisor to the Director of National Intelligence. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. DiTrani. And we also have Mr. Michael Pregent, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, who is joining us today. Thank you so much, Mr. Pregent. Also, we have Ambassador Mark Ginsburg, former ambassador to Morocco, former White House Middle East advisor for President Carter. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us. And I want to thank everybody who's attending. We have hundreds of audience who are joining us on Zoom, watching there, but many more who are watching us on our social media tools, on our Twitter and elsewhere. But I want to begin myself by introducing the new report, the new book that we just released today. It's called Iran, the imperative to reimpose UN sanctions. This book is 110 pages, and it contains details of the rogue behavior of the Iranian regime, different aspects of the rogue behavior, both in terms of what they're doing in the region, also in terms of terrorism, and showing basically that the issue of reimposing all of these UN Security Council resolutions is actually a must, it's a necessity based on the facts on the ground. Now, I want to elaborate a little bit about the book just for a few minutes to basically set the pace. And I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation to make that. Now, in terms of the topics that we've covered in the book, we've looked at really the modus operandi of the Velayat-e Faqih system. Unlike any other country, that they have military, they have factories, they do things, they have foreign policy. But in terms of the Iranian regime, it's none of that. It's all, you have in addition to the regular army, you have the Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC and the Quds Force, whose job is terrorism. It's a institutionalized, state-sponsored terrorism. And then you have the regime manufacturing arms, not for other purposes, but actually to supply to its proxies to attack the neighboring countries in the region. Then the whole orientation of that is actually an aggressive posture. So in other words, what the providing arms to a regime with this kind of a nature is actually feeding terrorism and actually feeding the mayhem that is being created in the region. Now, we're going to take a look at the Aerospace Industries Organization, which is the, an integral part of the IRGC, really controlled by them, whose job is primarily building the missiles. And I'm going to take a look at different aspects of it, just to give the perspective of like what it is that we're talking about. Let's look at the unit. It's called the Cruise Missile Group Industries. And as you can see here, that unit is actually, there are several units under it: the Faqih Industries, the Moslemi Industries, and the Rahimi Industries. The group also has a research arm for cruise industries. And the cruise missiles that were used to attack the Saudi oil infrastructure in 2019, in September 2019, were actually manufactured by the Cruise Industries Group at Parchin Section 4. I will get to that. And then the so-called Quds 1 missiles supplied to the Yemeni Houthis are actually a similar missile used by the regime. And the and then you can see the Fajr group, which is a precision device section of the Aerospace Industries Organization. They're in charge of producing electronics and guidance systems of the missiles, including the gyroscope used in various missiles. So, and then right after that, you can see marked on the right side, the Baramani Industries, which is part of the Hemad missile industry, is actually also known as Code 6000. That works on producing electronic and guidance equipment for ballistic missiles for the Iranian regime. And you may recall that when UN Security Council, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres put out his report earlier, he said the cruise missiles and drones used in attack on Aramco oil facilities in Saudi Arabia were equipped with gyroscope similar to the ones produced by the regime. So having said that, let's look at like the missile that actually was launched on the Aramco facility, oil facility in Saudi Arabia. The unit that was actually responsible for firing that was actually the missile base of the IRGC's, just the Navy's third region to attack the Aramco facility. The naval missile unit of the IRGC fired the cruise missiles targeting Saudi Arabia's oil refinery. And here is the place, the base is called Ismaeel Daqayeqi base. It's actually on the road going from Aghajari to Behbahan in Khuzestan province. And it's 40 kilometers away from the Omidyeh base, that's where the headquarters of the command headquarters were. And this was the unit that was responsible, based on our information, for firing those missiles. Now, let's look at the other aspect of that, and that's the roadside bombs. The roadside bombs that are very, instrumental tool for the regime to inflict damage, including the more advanced ones called the EFPs, exclusively foreign projectiles. There are other members of this panel who can tell you how the EFPs were used in Iraq and other places, and I won't get into those details. And the production was actually ordered by the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards, and they are now producing those in Section 5 of the Parchin military complex. Let's look at the map of Parchin. It has some, 11 different units. Each of them dedicates a huge place dedicated to different purposes. Now, the Section 5, as you can see here, as marked by red arrow, is where actually they're now producing the EFPs and the explosive foreign projectiles sent to different places to target And the most recent case was August 13 of this year. That's just like a week ago, that they used those EFPs against the US military in Nasiriyah in Iraq. Again, as I said, other members of the panel will probably have a lot more to share with you about that. Now, let's look at the production of the unmanned aerial vehicles and drones by the Iranian regime. They are actually, this is the map of, this is actually the west of the Imam Hussein University in Tehran. And the little airport you see as circled there, that place is run by the Revolutionary Guards. And it's actually a complex working on reverse engineering, and they produce unmanned aerial vehicles, ultralight aircraft and drones, and installing cameras and other equipment on drones and other gyros. Now, the other aspect I want to cover, and we have a lot of these in details in the book, the other aspect is actually the terrorism aspect of the Iranian regime, which actually terrorism is actually as a cornerstone of the Iranian regime. It's used to basically, it's used for the survival of the Iranian regime. There was an upsurge in terrorist operations in the West, including in Albania, in Denmark, in France, in Germany, in Turkey, in the United States. This is all in the past 2 years. And the Iranian regime, at the time that they actually need Europe the most, they have stepped up their terror operations on European soil. And I don't know if anyone can explain to me what's the reason behind it. If they're angry at some other countries, why Europe? Why waging terror operations in the European nations? Just look at their track record. In the past 2 years, European nations had to expel 4 Iranian regime so-called terror diplomats from Albania. One of them was actually their ambassador. The first time an ambassador of the Iranian regime is being expelled on terror charges. And then one of them is on trial in Belgium, Asdollah Assadi, for physically delivering the high explosive bomb to 2 other culprits. And he was caught. The first time an Iranian regime diplomat in the past 40 years is being put on trial on terrorism charges. And then another one was expelled, diplomat expelled in France, 2 others in Netherlands, and 2 of their agents are now in jail in the United States, and also over a dozen are jailed now in Europe. But perhaps the most recent case was just this last week that Secretary Pompeo made an announcement, and he said that 13 officials involved in a brutal and intricately planned assassination carried out in Switzerland in 1990 as part of Iran's ongoing worldwide terrorism campaign. And they said he said that these 13 assassins who posed as Iranian diplomats were acting under the highest orders of their government to silence the opposition. And just yesterday, the State Department issued another statement releasing the names of the 13 assassins who were involved in this assassination back in April of 1990. Even though the case of the assassination of Professor Kazem Rajavi took place 30 years ago, but it's very encouraging that eventually those assassins are being designated, their names are being identified and exposed and published by the United States government, putting designations on that. That's an important and encouraging move on the part of the United States. With that, I would like to basically remind you again about the new book that we put out. This is the book we published today called The Imperative to Reimpose UN Sanctions on the Iran regime. And interestingly, in the back cover of the book is a quotation dating back to July 14, 2015, from Mrs. Maryam Rajavi. That's like an hour after the JCPOA was finalized. And she said, and I just quote part of it, she said, circumventing 6 UN Security Council resolutions, an unsigned agreement will not close the mullah's path to deception and access to nuclear bomb. She said that had the P5+1 been more decisive, the Iranian regime would have had no choice but to fully retreat from and permanently abandon its efforts to acquire nuclear weapons. The P5+1 should now insist on evicting the regime from the Middle East and prevent its regional meddling. She said the money poured into the regime's coffers must be placed under strict United Nations monitoring to ensure that it addresses the Iranian people's urgent needs. Otherwise, Khamenei will use these funds to further the policy of export of terrorism and fundamentalism in Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon, as well as to fill the coffers of the IRGC. And she said that, Mrs. Rajavi said that any agreement that disregards and fails to underscore the Iranian people's human rights will only embolden the regime in its suppression and relentless executions. She said, and the abuse of rights of the Iranian people and violations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. With that, I would like to now turn to our first speaker that I want to introduce. Let me go to Ambassador Joe DiTrani. Mr. DiTrani has served as the president of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance, which is a professional think tank. From 2003 to 2006, Ambassador DiTrani was actually the special envoy for the 6-party talks with North Korea and the US representative to the Korea Energy Development Organization. In 2010, during the Obama administration, Ambassador DiTrani was appointed director of the National Counterproliferation Center and special advisor to the director of the National Intelligence. Ambassador DiTrani was an officer in the Air Force and a distinguished military graduate at New York University. Ambassador DiTrani is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and has published extensively on issues related to nuclear non-proliferation. Ambassador DiTrani, again, welcome and thank you for joining us. Please, we are more than happy to hear your remarks.
Thank you, Alireza. It's an honor being here. Well, this is a subject that's very personal for me. I spent a few years living in Iran in the late 70s. So I got to know the people, I got to know the history, I got to know the culture. And I can tell you, I resonate so closely with the people of Iran. And as we look at what's going on in Iran right now with unemployment, and certainly COVID-19 affecting the whole world because it's a pandemic, but indeed in Iran, with inflation, one has to have significant empathy for the people who are going through this in Iran, knowing that the leadership in Iran, ever since we signed the JCPOA in 2015, which was going to be transformational, over $50 billion was unfrozen, $50 to $100 billion was unfrozen. And hopefully that money would go to the people of Iran. It would go to building industry, infrastructure, employment opportunities, a better standard of living. Rather, the theocracy continued with what we saw starting in the early 80s, and indeed in 83 with the Beirut bombing of the Marine Corps barracks, significant casualties. That continued, even with the unfrozen $50 to $1 billion, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in certainly Syria. Hezbollah, Hamas, proxies of the Iranian IRGC, the Quds Force, were out there perpetrating terrorist acts that works against the viability of good governance in the respective countries. The JCPOA was meant mainly, in addition to denuclearization and moving Iran off the nuclear path, to a transformation. And unfortunately, as we sit here in 2020, that has not happened. When we look at the nuclear issue, which was the predicate for moving forward with the JCPOA, we see up until 2003, despite the protestations from the leadership, that Iran was pursuing a nuclear weapons program. And that the IAEA monitors were having problems right from the beginning getting to visit and inspect various facilities in Iran. And that continues until today. With the JCPOA, and I can tell you, intellectually, professionally, one wanted to support that because if Iran could move away from the nuclear path and move away from aggression in the region, what they're doing with support to terrorist organizations, the proxies that are out there undermining good governance, that would have been profound, significant, but we've not seen that. We've not seen that. Terrorist activities continue. The support, in fact, to Hezbollah in Lebanon has increased significantly. My colleagues will talk about that. So when we look at the nuclear program, and right now we have the Director General of the IAEA was recently in Tehran talking about the lack of access IAEA monitors have to suspect non-declared facilities. This is not right. This is not right. That speaks to the whole question of trust in a relationship and what that means. And with the sunset clause with the JCPOA, in 2025, Iran could build very sophisticated centrifuges that will spin very, very quickly so that by 2030, they can enrich as much as they want. And the fact of the matter is, unless there are monitors there to ensure that it's staying at low enrichment levels, that can easily go to highly enriched uranium and then the nuclear program, but also the missile program. Ali Reza, you talked about missiles, whether it's the Shahab 3 or the Shahab 4, we're talking about missiles that have a reach of over 1,300 miles. Having worked with North Korea, the Iranian government has perfected the missile technology. And we saw the recent 2 launches of missiles from underground facilities during exercises in the Strait of Hormuz. These are capabilities that Iran has. So one has to wonder, and this is my bottom line, with 18 October coming up and the lifting of the arms embargo, what will Iran do with the weapons they will then purchase and the weapons that they will then sell? Hopefully not to, but obviously to include to their proxies, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, whether it's in Yemen with the Houthis, whether it's in Iraq with the militias, or Syria. These are issues that are so significant that touch global security. So one has to wonder with the lifting of this arms embargo, what the consequences will be, especially if the IAEA monitors are not permitted in there, especially if Iran continues on the path they're on now. So when we talk about UN Security Council Resolution 2231 and snapbacks, I think what the US is saying, and others have been very supportive of this, is saying there are 6 resolutions out there that Iran must understand that they cannot get away with their behavior, what they have been doing. And indeed, in the final analysis, it hurts the people of Iran. And if these resolutions, these 6 resolutions, these UN Security Council 2231 resolutions are not enforced, if they should fade away, where are we going with Iran on this? So my final point on this is, look, the people of Iran are the key issue here. Because indeed, the theocracy that's making these decisions, supporting these proxies, are not caring for the people of Iran. Because we see that through demonstrations, we see through other manifestations. And that's where the focus needs to be. And hopefully if the community comes together and says, enough with your exporting this terrorism, enough with the threats of a nuclear weapon and nuclear proliferation. Focus on good governance, responsible leadership, and caring for your own people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ditrani, for your great remarks. You emphasized that the JCPOA, the past 5 years, not only it hasn't addressed the nuclear concern, which was the main purpose of the agreement, but what was also promised was the transformation of the behavior of the Iran regime that you mentioned that hasn't happened. You highlighted the role of the regime in dealing with terrorism, with its proxies, its continuation of defying the International Atomic Energy Agency and its own commitments. You also mentioned on the need to reimpose the 6 UN Security Council resolutions. And finally, you closed with the people of Iran. And they are the key issue. They are the key people who have spoken up against this regime in the protests and the demonstrations. That has to be a key factor in looking at Iran. And I think the behavior of the regime in the region would give me the right segue to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Michael Pridgent, who is actually the senior fellow at the Huston Institute. He is the Middle East analyst and former adjunct lecturer of the College of International Studies Affairs and a visiting fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Mr. Pridgent has over 28 years of experience working security, terrorism, counterinsurgency, and policy issues in the Middle East, North Africa, and Southwest Asia. He's a hands-on person who's seen things, experiencing firsthand himself. He spent considerable time working the malign activities of the Iranian regime, influence in Iraq particularly. And Mr. Pridgent, we'd like to hear your thoughts. Thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm here as a former intelligence officer to talk about the regime's activities. Specifically what the regime did under the protections of the Iran deal, of the JCPOA. Remember in 2015, when there was sanctions relief, the Iranian people never saw the economic benefit of that deal. Instead, the regime created new militias in Iraq, began to provide lethal aid to the Houthis in Yemen, began to move Iraqi militias and Quds Force officers to Syria to prop up the Assad regime. Qasem Soleimani went to Moscow to invite Russia in. Russia came in to bring in S-300s and S-400s and to use Iranian proxies on the ground, from Lebanese Hezbollah to Iraqi militias to Quds Force advisors on the ground, as they're forced to go after the regime's opposition, meaning the Assad regime's opposition, not to go after ISIS, but to go after Syrians that were opposed to Assad, killing Syrians with barrel bombs. So let's talk about this Iran, because critics will say that when the president walked away from the Iran deal in 2018, that all this bad behavior began. No, the Iran deal accelerated this bad behavior. The Iran deal basically reactivated everything Qasem Soleimani had put in place to fund proxies, to get arms to proxies across the region, all the way to Yemen and beyond. And I would argue, and I've testified in front of Congress, that there would still be an Iran deal today if Iran didn't use the economic windfall of sanctions relief to support ballistic missiles, to support regional terrorism, to provide lethal aid to its proxy groups, and to further destabilize Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. So that's where we are today. And with the expiration of the arms deal on October 18th, the arms embargo, it demonstrates how unserious Russia was, how unserious China was, and unfortunately how unserious our European allies were on the Iran deal. They simply signed on so that they could exploit Iran's economy, so they could exploit the Iranian people. And what I mean by that is, if you look at what Russia has done with regards to making deals with Iran, they've taken away water rights. They've taken away oil and gas rights. China is set to do the same thing. And that's why it's so important for the United States to put snapback sanctions back in place to not only keep China and Russia from selling weapons, offensive capabilities to this regime that will further destabilize the Middle East, but to protect the Iranian people from a flood of Chinese imports, from predatory lenders like China that will simply go into Iran and exploit its resources, build infrastructure that is not for the Iranian civilian, but for China itself, and to push this offensive capability into a region that is already being destabilized by the Quds force. We do not want to see Iran become a conventional military threat. They have not become an economic power, and that's a good thing. And that's something Russia and China are trying to salvage. Iran is not where Russia and China thought it would be in 2020. When they signed on to the Iran deal, they believed that Iran would be an economic powerhouse by now. It would be ready to buy conventional weapons, that a Democrat government in the United States would be acquiescent, would continue to provide incentives based on provocations by this regime, something the regime has used as a playbook in these 40 years. And something I stress always is that this regime, in its 40-year history, they do not own Iran's history. They do not own Iran's culture. They do not own what Iranians think about their futures and their lives ahead. So it's important to talk about what Iran is doing when it comes to EFPs, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, all violations of existing UN Security Council resolutions. But it's also important to call out our allies and our geopolitical foes for supporting a regime that wants to continue to destabilize the region. The Iranian people are against this regime. For the first time in Iraq, all ethnic sects in Iraq, the Shia, the Sunnis, and the Kurds, are against Iran's interference. We're seeing what's happening in Lebanon. Qasem Soleimani built a land bridge under the protections of the Iran deal before the president walked out. And the protesters have occupied that land bridge from Tehran to Baghdad to Beirut. And that's important. Snapback sanctions are a tool to test the resolve of our allies. If they don't go along, the United States still has a whole host of things it can do unilaterally. The United States has not even done maximum pressure yet. There's so much more we can do. So I look forward to the next, September 19th is when these snapback sanctions are supposed to go into effect. So I look forward to the dialogue. And I assure you that if President Trump doesn't win re-election, that there is no appetite in DC for a Biden administration to simply walk back into the Iran deal without serious concessions. We've seen Biden's platform outlined in CNAS, a think tank here in DC, and it's very weak. It talks about addressing regional behavior. It doesn't talk about ballistic missiles, but it hints at it, but only after they've re-entered the Iran deal. And that's not something that Senator Schumer, Senator Menendez, and Democrats that were strong-armed in 2015 by the Obama machine have an appetite for. Biden's Iran team, if he's elected, is not going to have primacy. The domestic portfolio is going to have primacy, and I would even say China's going to have. The China team's going to have more funds and more assets and more of a spotlight put on it than the Iran team. I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions. But this is a time for our allies to actually hold China and Russia responsible, because the United States can hold Iran responsible. When I say Iran, the regime responsible alone, and we have those options. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. You gave an excellent overview of what the Iranian regime, the Revolutionary Guards, the Quds Force have been doing in Iraq. But also you highlighted the fact that the public, the population in the region are rising up against the Iranian regime. The example you drew in Iraq that both the Shiites, the Sunnis, and the Kurds are actually opposing in a very active way by their protest against this regime. It's a very, very important phenomenon. Most of those protests are taking place in Shia-dominated cities in Najaf, Karbala, Basra, and other places. And I think that's an important fact everyone has to keep in mind. You also mentioned the people of Iran, that they've spoken up against this regime, and that they don't want this regime. And therefore, you also talked about the maximum pressure, that you know, the worst is yet to come. And I want to add the whole issue of the corruption, that much of the misery that comes in terms of the economy in Iran actually comes from the very corrupt economic system of the Iran regime that is entirely controlled by the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards, you know, over 2/3 of it. And they are the ones who are plundering the wealth of the nation. They're the ones who are stealing money left and right. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. Only one foundation out of over a dozen foundations that Supreme Leader Khamenei controls, Setad, has over $95 billion worth of assets. And there's a long list of others who are totally under the control of Khamenei, and he's not using any of those resources to help fighting the pandemic. Instead, the money continues to go to their militias, their proxies, as Mr. President said very nicely, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and other places in the region. And you also mentioned the role of the diplomacy and what actually Europeans really need to do in waking up and not carrying the water for the Ayatollahs. Now let's go to Ambassador Mark Ginsburg. Mr. Ginsburg spent his formative years in the Middle East. He was appointed by President Clinton to serve for 4 years in Morocco as the US ambassador in Morocco. Ambassador Ginsburg commenced his government career as a national security legislative assistant to Senator Edward Kennedy. During the Carter administration, Ambassador Ginsburg was actually appointed the deputy senior advisor to President Carter Middle East policy in the White House. And in 1993, Ambassador Ginsburg served as the deputy press secretary to President Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign and the co-national security director for Vice President Al Gore's 2000 presidential campaign. Ambassador Ginsburg, with that record of all the work you've done, pretty much all of the time you spent in the Middle East, following and observing and being there, we are very interested to hear your thoughts. Ambassador Ginsburg, please.
Thank you, Ali Reza. And it's a real honor to be on this panel with my colleagues, very distinguished colleagues, shall we say, I dare say, far more expert than I am. But I want to go back to and look at the situation where we are and where we've been. I had the unfortunate occasion of when I was about 28 years old to have been designated by the White House to sit in on the Iranian National Security Council deliberations at the time when the uprising began against the Shah. I was not there in any other capacity other than as an observer to advise the then Chief of Staff of the White House on what was taking place. And as I watched this as a young man and saw how an administration, the Carter administration, wrapped itself up in knots about what to do about the human rights aspects of the revolution, the attitudes towards the Shah, the importance of perhaps supporting the provisional government. The one thing that stuck with me was that after the hostage taking by the Iran revolutionary, by the revolution, I came to realize that foreign policy formulated towards Iran was undertaken by people and organizations that had very little experience in understanding exactly what was taking place inside Iran. And even today, as I look at the foreign policy dilemma that the United States faces in dealing with Iran, I'm struck by certain headlines that always leap out to me. Not only, of course, its 40-year record of terrorism, its 40-year record of subjugating and repressing its own public, but we tend to forget how many tens of thousands of innocent Iranians have been murdered by this regime in order to maintain its power, how much money has gone into the coffers of its leadership, the kleptocracy of the theological revolutionary dictatorship that this regime represents, and how ill-advised we are at times about whether we want to pursue regime change, whether or not an Iran nuclear deal is going to result in a change of attitude by the regime. And I'm struck at this point in time by the reality of what has taken place ever since President Trump decided to withdraw from the Iran nuclear agreement. I go back to the revelations of the intelligence that has been provided, the International Atomic Energy Agency and all of the Western governments, that Iran was already violating the JCPOA before the ink was even dry on the Iran nuclear deal. It had established a separate secret factory to develop centrifuges, which, as many of you may know, is essential for the enrichment of uranium. And as it has, once it entered into this JCPOA, it did so because it had what it thought was a government in the United States and in Europe, governments in Europe, that would provide it the financial sanctions relief it needed in order to pursue its military objectives. Look, let's make no mistake about what this regime is really standing for. It's a Leninist regime wanting to promote its version of a Leninist communist theology and to cause revolution and conquest to occur throughout the Middle East. It is not by accident that its leadership has created the concept of this so-called Shiite crescent to stretch from Tehran all the way across to Lebanon. And I'll get more into that in a second. But since the President Trump's decision to withdraw from the agreement, think about the fact that in retaliation, again, I'm using the word in retaliation, Iran violated the agreement further by lifting the limits on heavy water stockpiles and by removing the cap on enriched uranium. Now, some argue that this was a spiteful reaction to Mr. Trump's unilateral withdrawal, but I suggest that the facts speak otherwise. The other thing that strikes me about where we are with Iran is how much the regime is still intending to try to force the world to bend to its will. And as my colleagues referenced, when you look at its involvement in Yemen, supporting the Houthi rebels, its abject support for Hezbollah and Hamas in their efforts to destroy Israel, its determination to bend the Iraqi government to its knees, its support for the cutthroat Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, it's crushing freedom rather than, in effect, promoting a new vision of a more liberal Shiite religious permutation in the Middle East. Well, and all we have to do is look at the future of Lebanon and what Iran has done there. You know, it doesn't have to be this way. Iran could have risen from the revolution as a responsible member of the international order, but it really chose the other road. And here we are 40 years later, Western democracies debating among themselves whether or not we should re-enter the JCPOA, whether we should not. I want to remind our audience, the Iran nuclear deal was meant to buy time for Israel meant to buy time before the United States and other countries would have to use military means to destroy Iran's nuclear capacity, with the bet, a roll of the dice, with a roll of the dice that Iran would moderate its behavior because of sanctions relief. And yet, as we have seen, that bet has not paid off. And it hasn't paid off. I want to be charitable to my colleagues because I am, after all, a Democrat, a proud Democrat, who has looked at this from the context of what is taking place on the ground. The bet that was rolled by President Obama was meant to see whether or not this could occur, that in fact the regime would change its attitude and would moderate and become a responsible player. Well, look, it didn't happen. And it's important for our Democrats, my fellow Democrats, to acknowledge that as much as they are disciples of their handiwork of the Iran nuclear deal, their bet, their roll of the dice, evidence that Iran would not use the occasion of integrating back into the Western world as a responsible player, but continue to accelerate its repression and its terrorism. I think all of us had hoped that that transformation would occur and that sanctions relief would result in relief to its public. But just think about what has happened since the Iran nuclear deal was signed. As Ali Reza mentioned, case after case of terrorism committed against Iran opposition leaders. Why, just 2 years ago, the Iranian regime dispatched agents to blow up the MEK NCRI global opposition leadership of Iran in Paris. These agents were arrested on their way to, in effect, bomb the site outside Paris, where many Americans had come. It was so fortunate that the intelligence authorities of Europe were able to interdict it. Think of the fact that Denmark has expelled Iranian diplomats for planning and plotting terrorism. And the same holds true for Albania, where Iranian agents have tried to blow up and to commit terrorism against the refuge that has been taken by the decent people who were under the gun of the Iraqi government and under the auspices of the United Nations, and with the help of the United States have found refuge in Albania. So Europe is at a crossroads along with the United States. And yet Iran continues to target our allies. It targets US shipping in the Gulf. It targets US diplomats. It wanted to commit murder in the United States here against the Saudi ambassador, as everyone knows. And just a year ago, the United States arrested Iranian agents that were targeting Ali Reza and others. They were arrested in California for wanting to commit God knows what against the innocent people who here are just merely supporting democracy in Iran. In addition, of course, it's mentioned that Iran plotted the attack against Saudi oil installations, etc. So, as I look at where we are and where we have to be, what really in the end is in the best interest of the Iranian people? Isn't that what really should drive policy by Europe and the United States? We need a more unified policy by the United States and by our European allies to essentially come to an agreement. We cannot bet again on an Iran nuclear deal as the end-all and where-all of ultimately hoping that the Iranian revolutionary dictatorship would fall because the good people of Iran would be able to arise on their own. We've seen that movie has no longer merit. First, we need a new alliance between the United States and Europe to achieve what the Iranian people need, not what the regime needs in order to sustain itself. We need a covert campaign of diplomatic, humanitarian, and economic support to empower opposition leaders like Madam Rajavi, the NCRI. And if anyone was able to see this huge number of people who traveled from all over the world last year to the Paris convocation, you would understand the support that this opposition has both in and out of Iran. Third, we've got to protect Iran's adversaries. Those are being targeted by Iran in the region. If they succumb to Iran's revolutionary dictatorship and terrorism, what do we have to say for ourselves? An Iran nuclear deal is supposed to stop that? A new deal is supposed to stop that? I think in the end, that's quite naive. And let me close by saying that cutting off Iran's financial access to Western transactional centers is important, targeting their terrorism financing, as well as finally, let's agree that the objective of our policy is not to provide another window for Iran to continue its nuclear development, not to give it another 10 years or 5 years to extend the existing agreement, but to keep our eye on the fact that what we need to do is to finally end the global nightmare that this Iran government represents for ourselves, for our adversaries, and for a better world. If we continue to think that by vaccinating Iran with a nuclear deal is going to solve the global pandemic that it has imposed on the world, I'm sorry to say, I think that is unfortunate and is not going to happen. Thank you, Ali Reza.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ginsburg. You really certainly made very important points. So you had some policy recommendations at the end. As a Democrat, and you showed that, you know, no matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, the facts on the ground speak for themselves. You highlighted the fact that with the JCPOA, without the JCPOA, the Iran regime was in violation, has been and continues to be in violation of its nuclear commitments. You mentioned that the whole purpose of the JCPOA was to buy time, and that there was hope, everyone hoped that there would be a moderation in the behavior of the Iran regime, and you highlighted that that never happened. You mentioned a list of terror plots by the Iranian regime everywhere, how they had surged, and the fact that there needs to be, Europe needs to come on the side of the people of Iran. You mentioned that the alliance that the US makes with Europe should not be based on the interests of the Iranian regime, rather the interests of the people of Iran. And that's the key word, the key element that has always been left out in various administrations in the past 40 years. When you leave out the key factor of the people of Iran, what they want, as all of the other speakers very eloquently referred to, then you end up with the wrong policy and you end up going nowhere. At the end of the day, the regime will survive. So you said ending the nightmare, that's exactly what we're all looking for. Now I want to go to the question and A session. I want to reemphasize those who want to pose their questions. Though if you're on Zoom, you can write your question on the Q&A mechanism, or if you're watching on social media, you email your questions to media@ncri-us.org. I already have some questions coming in. First of all, this question is for Ambassador Joe DiTrani. Ambassador DiTrani, you you've experienced the Iranian regime and you know what they have been up to, what they've been doing over the years, and you listed a long history of their cheating, even before 2003, after that, during the JCPOA, after the JCPOA. The question is, what do you do with a regime that has been cheating repeatedly and consistently? What's the way to deal with the cheaters?
Well, it's a very good question. As you mentioned when you introduced me, Ali Reza, I was the negotiator with North Korea, and with North Korea, we continue to insist on complete, verifiable denuclearization. And that's what it's all about. The JCPOA with the sunset clause does not provide that element there, complete, verifiable. It is, you can have as many centrifuges, sophisticated, starting in 2025 and 2030. You can enrich as much as you want. And hopefully you'll let the IAE monitors come in. Well, we've not seen the IAE monitors get the access they need. So my recommendation would be very clearly that Iran has to understand, if they want sanctions lifted, if they want to be, the government wants to be treated as a responsible actor for the welfare of its people, so that sanctions indeed are lifted and they can have the normal interaction with all other nation states, ceasing terrorism, obviously, the proxies, obviously, but also seeking a path to nuclear weapons, because nuclear proliferation and the ability of selling a nuclear weapon or fissile material really is a major threat to the global security. All of us are involved with this. So I think Iran has to understand this is what's necessary. These are the paths you have. The path you could take is a normal nation state, lift sanctions, we move forward, but commit yourself to complete verifiable, but also stop, cease and desist with the exporting of terrorism and the support to proxies that are undermining good governance in other states.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ditrani. I want to pose the next question to Michael Pridgent. Michael, you elaborated very nicely all the details of what the regime has been doing in the region. And I want to ask you, in terms of the snapback of the UN sanctions, you did mention that that's a necessity and how it would hurt. Can you elaborate what the snapback would do, both in terms of the regime inside Iran, but also its impact in terms of Iranian influence in Iraq?
Okay, so if we do snapback, right, September 19th, if everything goes into place, the United States cannot then carve out Iraq and make exceptions for Iraq to be able to buy gas and oil from Iran. It cannot continue to push money into Baghdad while militias tied to Tehran are in the Ministry of Interior, or in the Ministry of Defense, or in Iraq's security apparatus. Snapback means something, and then you can't just carve out Iraq and say, well, it doesn't apply to Iraq, because then our allies and our geopolitical competitors would say the United States is actually now in violation of its own snapback sanctions. So when it goes in place, and I hope it goes in place because it needs to go in place, and I know I said hope is not a method. Let me separate hope. I'm not hoping the regime changes, because the only way the regime changes is if it is replaced. But I do want the United States to be very serious about snapback sanctions, because it's important. It's important ahead of an election. It will actually give the Biden administration, if it wins, leverage to negotiate with this regime. And again, I argue against negotiating with this regime at all, because it gives it a lifeline. But as far as Iraq goes, this changes everything. If on September 19th, snapback sanctions go into effect, there are a lot of things that Iraq can no longer do. And that's why these contracts with General Electric and with Chevron are so important. The ones that Prime Minister Kadhimi signed in Washington, D.C., is because they were not done in isolation. They are done to complement snapback, to give Iraq an out, to help Iraq develop its own capacity. But again, the United States cannot do business with Iraq, continue to support Baghdad, as long as these militias operate outside of Baghdad's control, and snapback would give the United States an additional tool to do the right thing.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pridgent. That was very thorough and detailed. Now, let me pose the last question to Ambassador Ginsburg. You talked about Europe and how they really need to get on board and thinking about the right policy and learning lessons. What do you think is the problem? What is it that the European nations or whoever pursues a policy of appeasement don't see?
Unfortunately, I think a lot of it had to do with the belief that Iran would become one big shopping center for European companies, that sanctions relief would enable Iran to, if not buy in the United States, then buy and modernize its economic foundation in Europe. And so there was, number one, a belief that the JCPOA would enable Iran to become a huge commercial market for Europe. I think, though, in number two, there's this sense that the threat of an Iran nuclear weapons program does not pose the same type of threat footprint to Europe as it may be perceived in the United States and to American allies. And so I think that there's a real challenge here that Europeans convince themselves that an Iran with nuclear weapons was not as much of a threat, and therefore, while it encouraged the JCPOA, and while European countries were obviously directly involved in its negotiations, I got the sense that their concerns were took a backseat to the concerns of the United States and perhaps Canada, and I think that that's one of the reasons why we've had this dichotomy of far more emphasis and concern in the United States that is not just based purely on our relationship with Israel, but on American interests in the Middle East and our sense of responsibility and duty for the people in the Middle East who are threatened by Iran that Europe itself never felt or feels the same way.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We're getting closer to the end of our program. I just want to sum up myself the fact that many of you elaborated today very eloquently that the 2015 termination of the provisions of the 6 UN Security Council resolutions did not prevent the Iranian regime from striving to obtain the nuclear bomb, nor did it tame the behavior of the Iran regime, what they're doing inside, and also what they're doing inside Iran. To the contrary, everyone discussed today that Tehran actually escalated its nuclear violations, it's heightened its regional aggression and stepped up terrorism in Europe, in the United States, and also cracked down on its own population. The experience over the past 4 decades, as many of you referred to, really has shown that the only way that the clerics, the only actual language they understand is the language of firmness and decisiveness. And therefore, building more pressure on the Iranian regime, and Mr. President said that, it's not even maximum pressure yet, building more pressure on the regime is actually indispensable to confronting its terrorism and aggression, and also its attempt to obtain nuclear bomb. Mrs. Rajavi, the president-elect of the NCRI, has repeatedly said, and I want to quote her, she said, this regime must not be allowed to acquire even a single bullet. It mustn't pocket profits from a single barrel of Iranian oil, and it must not spend even a single dollar from revenues belonging to the people of Iran for its own survival. And that's absolutely true. And it's for this reason, really, that we, on behalf of the people of Iran, really reiterate our long-standing call for the reimposition of the 6 UN Security Council resolutions on the Iranian regime. Under no circumstances, this regime should actually get any weapons to sell or even buy weapons in any capacity. And to end the nightmare, as Ambassador Ginsburg said, the threat of the Iranian regime, the world really needs to recognize the right of the people of Iran for change. And as they have already risen up in various cities all over, and the latest uprising was in January of this year. And since then, the protests, strikes by workers and others have continued despite the COVID-19 pandemic that's taken the lives of over 95,000 people so far. And it's important that the regime's leaders be put on trial instead of giving them concessions for the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in summer of 1988, for the killing of some 1,500 protesters in November of 2019, and the terror plots against the assassination of Iranian dissidents abroad. When the State Department designated just last week the 13 assassins of Professor Kazem Rajavi for killing the most renowned human rights champion of Iran some 30 years ago in Geneva in daylight, the message was very clear. There is no statute of limitations for serving justice. That's why that designation should be coupled by designating the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the current President Hassan Rouhani, the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, whose embassy was used for this murder, Ali Akbar Velayat-e, and the intelligence minister at the time, Ali Fallahian, who actually masterminded this cold-blooded murder. They must all be put on trial for crimes against humanity. By holding the regime's leaders to account, the world can really pave the way for a free Iran, as millions of Iranians are calling for it, as a free Iran contributes to world peace. And it's that beautiful prospect of Iran where a ballot box is the only criteria for legitimacy. People can speak freely. Men and women are treated equally and enjoy freedom. Where there is a separation between mosque and state, where there is free market economy, where the nations call for peace and coexistence with the neighboring countries instead of funding terror and creating mayhem, and where the resources are used for the prosperity of the people instead of nuclear weapons. Yes, that day for a free Iran is near and certainly worth fighting for. Again, I want to thank all of you, all the panel members, for your presence, for your great discussion. I want to thank all the audience for joining us. Thank you so much. Until the next time, goodbye and God bless all of you. Bye-bye.